looking at the time. Thanks, Stephanie.
Okay, are you seeing the proper screen in front of you?
We got it.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Today I'll be talking about Clark County's restoration actions at the Boulder City Conservation Easement, which is a conservation area that we manage specifically for the benefit of Mojave Desert tortoises. This property is located southwest of Boulder City and is highly accessible to the public. Most disturbances at the BCCE tend to be linear. We have a lot of decommissioned roads that need to be closed off, and we see a lot of unauthorized off-road vehicle use as well. To restore linear disturbances, we've been installing what I call end caps at the access points of the routes we want to close. Some of you might have different names for this process, but it's when we install materials at the access points for a large enough area to disguise line of sight, and then we just let the area restore itself after that. In the past, we've defaulted to vertical mulch for this because it's pretty low cost and low maintenance, and it can also be very effective. In 2017, we looked at 26 sites at the BCCE that had been closed with vertical mulch end caps 3 to 4 years prior, and all of them were being colonized by native annual plants. So it does work out pretty well a lot of the time. But we've noticed that vertical mulch tends to fail in some cases. If it starts to deteriorate before the area is filled in, it'll expose the access points, and people will start to drive through there again. And in areas that have a long history of use, the vertical mulch isn't going to stop people in a lot of cases because they still know that the road is back there. To try to improve our success rates, we switched to active revegetation for the end caps. We've been using plants salvaged from local construction sites, and once they're transplanted, we water them regularly until they're established, which usually takes several months. So far, this method is working well to prevent vehicle reentry, so we're hopeful that we'll see more improvement over time. Since active revegetation and maintenance watering is obviously much more expensive and labor intensive than just using vertical mulch, we'll need to continue monitoring all of our sites to see if the expense is worth it, but it is looking good so far. We're also doing a seeding project on a 4.6 kilometer stretch of road that used to be part of a really large OHV. And it had been used for many years before being decommissioned. Since this site has a long history of use, vertical mulch end caps didn't work for very long before vehicles started going through there again. We repaired the site with outplanted end caps instead, but before doing that, we set up a seeding experiment. Because of its history as a racetrack, the entire length of road was decompacted and imprinted to roughen the surface. Then the road was divided into 24 sections, and we used 3 different treatments: unseeded control, broadcast seeding with bare seeds, and pelletized seeds. The BCCE gets very little rainfall, even compared to some of the surrounding area. So we used seed pellets that are made of pine mulch held together with tackifier, which we thought might make germination easier in this environment compared to some more common types of seed pellet materials. Unfortunately, due to prolonged drought, we didn't see any germination last year, and we're not sure if we will anytime soon. But this site is getting monitored annually, and I'd be happy to provide updates in the future. And that's it.
Awesome. Very interesting, Stefanie. Does anybody have any questions for Stefanie? Okay, if you do, feel free to put them in the chat box as well. Okay, next up is Dale Devitt from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dale, are you able to speak right now?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm under grayscale duff. So my computer crashed and I'm working off my daughter's laptop. So I'm Dale Devitt, soil and water scientist in the School of Life Sciences at UNLV. And I've been doing some restoration work, primarily out at the Beaver Dam Wash National Conservation Area. We published a paper last year looking at Insidia virgensis and the impact of position within a wash and whether or not supplemental water and fencing. We published that in Restoration Ecology. We're following that up with a new study where we're looking at mother plants. These are plants, so we're planting fewer plants, but larger, older plants. And we're providing them with additional supplemental water throughout the spring and summer months. And what we want to look at really is the interaction between precipitation, supplemental water, environmental demand, and soil water dynamics, and link that to flower and seed production, and seedling establishment. So we just have that initiated right now. And so I don't have any results for that. The other thing we've been working on for the last 5 years now is really work associated with solar facilities. We're working out in El Dorado Valley, have been since 2015, and looking at the impact that solar facilities have on desert ecosystems. So although it's not a direct restoration study, it has restoration implications. And there, what we are looking at is the impact they have on decoupling surface washes and moving sensible heat, extra energy heat, into the adjacent habitat. We're seeing a footprint of probably 200 to 400 meters in which temperatures as high as 6 to 8 degrees C warmer than down gradient locations. So we know this heat is coming over early morning hours. So we have lower number of freezing temperatures, which is perhaps a positive thing, but at the same time, we're getting these nighttime higher temperatures, which obviously will elevate respiration. So we don't know the total story there, but hopefully we'll start to unravel it. But we're starting to see, there's, like I said, a very linear gradient up to about 400 meters in the shift in leaf xylem water potential, where it doubles from 70 bars down to 35 bars, just over that 400 meters. The other thing we've been doing is a study out in Pahrump, looking at facilities in which they have left the vegetation intact and the washes intact, and we see a huge impact on the vegetation, very positive impact. So although it's an altered habitat, it is a functional habitat, I believe. The plants are larger, they're greener, they're photosynthesizing to a greater extent, measured with a Lycor system. They have more favorable water potentials. Their non-structural carbohydrates are elevated. Their stem elongation rates are better. So overall, it looks like that's the paradigm shift we'd like to see. We've done some restoration work inside the facility and find that those plants that survive do so better in tighter solar panel density, higher density, because there's less visual view, I think, for the predator-prey interaction. That when we find dead rabbits, it's always over in the area where there's wider spacing between the solar panels, so the coyotes can see better. And so that's really what we've been doing. We'll continue to work on this and try to publish 2 or 3 papers here this year on it, and happy to answer anybody's questions they may have.
Thanks, Dale. And we'll get another chance to talk more in depth about restoration at solar energy and other renewable energy sites in the next session. So thanks for teeing that up. Any immediate questions for Dale? Okay, moving on to Derek Hall from the Nevada National Security Site. And I will share Derek's slides, which are some really cool photos.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I'm Derek Hall. I'm a principal scientist at the Nevada National Security Site, formerly known as the Nevada Test Site. So you've heard some reference to that site in some of the previous talks. So I'd like to acknowledge Jeanette Perry as well, my colleague, who's working on this with me as well. So we've been, I've been working on revegetation since the early 90s with the Yucca Mountain Project out there, and then some other soil cleanup studies, both on the site as well as up near Tonopah on the Tonopah Test Range and out on the Nevada Test Range as well. So the project I'm talking about today is in tortoise habitat. It's a little bit different. This site is a low-level radioactive waste management site. So they're burying low-level radioactive waste, covering it with about 8 feet of soil. And then the idea is that we plant and establish a perennial vegetation community on the top of these waste cover caps that will, through evapotranspiration, keep the water from going down into the waste. So we're kind of starting with a highly modified but blitzed environment, kind of a clean slate, if you will. So this just kind of shows after the soil caps have to be, they're engineered, and so they have to be compacted to certain levels. And so part of the process is we've got to make sure that we have that top foot or two lightly compacted so that the roots can develop and grow. And so we use a bulldozer here. We rip the site. We also put about 9 to 12 inches of topsoil, but also some subsurface soils as well. And so we're kind of looking maybe at some differences there to see if maybe it doesn't have to be straight topsoil. Maybe you can use some subsurface soils, 6 to 12 inches down, or even deeper than that, and still be successful. So we rip the site, and then the next slide. And then we seed it. We use a drill seeder, but we pull the seed tubes, and so we're broadcasting the seed onto the surface of the soil. And then you can see kind of at the tail end, there's a chain harrow that we use, and that chain harrow drags the soil over the seed and covers the seed. As you know, in our seed mix, we have about 12 or 13 different species. Some are light and fluffy seed, some are hard seed. And so we're trying to optimize the depth of burial for that seed. And this type of chain harrow seems to be really effective at that, so that we get some pretty good response from both the light and fluffy seed as well as the heavier seed. One of the things that we do also is we pre-treat the ambrosia, domosa, and creosote bush seed. We rinse it for about 24 hours. We've done some studies and found that germination rates are higher, rinsing off, especially for the creosote bush, the germination inhibitor. And so we pre-treat that, then dry it, and then mix it with the other species in the fluffy seed mix. We put that in the fluffy seed bin, which is the bigger bin. It has a different kind of auger to get the seed out. And then the rear box is more of the hard seed box, where we put the hard seeded species like Urofedras and Atroplexes. So we seed it, cover it. Next slide. And then we use a hydromulch. So I know when Scott talked about the mulching, we've done several studies. We found that mulching does, in our studies, it is successful. It increases germination. It helps to ameliorate surface temperatures, and it also allows for more water retention, having this mulch on the surface. So we use a hydromulch. We've done straw before, where we blow straw and then we crimp that in. That can be effective as well, but we've kind of, in this environment for the Mojave, it seems like this hydromulch seems to work a little bit better. You don't get as much of the straw blowing off with the wind, and sometimes those whisker rows that you're left with straw crimping can, with the winds and the soil movement, can attract or trap the sand and actually bury your seed too deeply. And so this hydromulching seems to work pretty good. Next slide. What we found is that in order to be successful, you have to use irrigation. I mean, that's the bottom line. We know that water drives the whole ecosystem in the Mojave Desert. And so it is expensive, but it's effective. And so this is a site we seeded last February. This picture was taken in October. And if you look, you can see a lot of the light green, all that light green vegetation there is all Atroplex polycarpa. There's some Atroplex canescens mixed in there as well. And you can see very little invasives. You can see a little bit of halogete and a little bit of Russian thistle, kind of those browner color plants there. But it was amazing. We've got over 20 seedlings per meter squared of our seeded species, 5 or 6 species that did quite well. So this is what it looks like 6 months after we seeded, last February. Next slide. This was a picture I took just a week or two ago. We've actually got a herd of antelope that are foraging on that cap. I don't have any tortoises yet, but again, these are kind of isolated waste cover caps. So we're not necessarily doing this work to get tortoise, to create tortoise habitat, but the techniques that we're using, I think, are very valid and useful in applying elsewhere to create, again, like you can see the success just in 6 or 8 months time period. The irrigating, We use those wheel line irrigation systems, very effective at moving a lot of water. And we put about an inch down in March. What we tried to do is we tried to keep that surface inch or two moist for as long as we could through March. So we irrigated pretty much through the month of March. We moved those wheel lines every hour. It was very labor intensive, but it was definitely worth it. So put about an inch in 1/4 inch increments. We can put about a 1/4 of an inch an hour of irrigation. And then in April, we put another 1/2 inch down. And then in May, the end of May, we put another 1.75 inches down. And that was basically to drive that soil moisture as deep as we could in order to give the plants a chance to survive the hot, dry summer. We didn't irrigate at all during the summer. And we had really good success. We didn't do measurements, but looking at it, we didn't have a lot of plant die-off. And so that mostly the Atroplex, polycarp, and canescens definitely survived the hot, dry summer without any irrigation. So if you can pull up that table, if you have that, Julia, just kind of shows our results. We seeded in February and then we monitored in May. Atroplex polycarpa was the main one, but we got some Atroplex canescens, really good densities of the Nevada ephedra, and that's been consistent through most of our studies. The Nevada joint fir, Nevada ephedra, ephedra nevadensis, great species. It should be, in my opinion, used in every seed mix. The Atroplex polycarpa and canescens also do quite well. We even had a lot of Bailea come up, the multiradiata. Had a lot of that come up. We had a little bit of ambrosia and a little bit of creosote bush as well. Not as much as we would have liked, but part of this project as well is we've hand collected white burr sage and creosote bush seed in the years, like the last few years when we did have good moisture and we actually had a good seed crop. We collected several pounds of those two species, and we've contracted with the Nevada Division of Forestry in Las Vegas to grow transplants out for us, using that locally collected seed right from around that the environment of the waste cover area. And so we put transplants in as well to kind of supplement, mainly with the white burr sage and creosote bush, because they are a little more difficult to get up from seed. So we are supplementing with those two species. So real quick, one of the other things that we did a fall seeding one on another waste cover cap, and we found that it was a failure. Unfortunately, we had great densities come up, but halogeton came in and took over the site. Especially in these blitzed areas, anytime you disturb the soil and there's halogeton around, or maybe even if it's not around, it'll come in, especially in the fall, and just takes over your site. And so we lost a lot of our transplants and our seedlings because of competition from halogeton. So we're going to go in and supplement that with additional transplants. Again, one of those lessons learned, I think, is as the practitioners or researchers, I think we need to get together as a community, like Todd is suggesting, and Scott, because we have a lot of information and knowledge that we've learned over the years, applying different treatments and things like that. And I think we can come up with a pretty good synthesis. And then just one other thing that it's not so much in tortoise habitat, but we are looking at is we had a wildfire burned about 26,000 acres last May in mainly kind of the sagebrush and low elevation pinyon juniper habitat. And so we've gone in, we've created a study where we're using the imazapic as well as indaziflam herbicide treatments, and then some seeding treatments to see what treatment will best control. It's primarily cheatgrass, maybe a little bit of red brome, but trying to see which treatments might, get a handle on maybe some of that cheatgrass control. And then we also seeded with a nice diverse mix of seed, locally, adapted seed there. I'm going to throw this out there, and I may get crucified for this, but we even are trying some kochia prostrata treatments and some Siberian wheatgrass. And so we've got a few plots that we put Siberian wheatgrass and forage kochia to see if that treatment is effective in that kind of environment. Probably doesn't lend itself well in the Mojave Desert, but maybe on that edge between Great Basin and Mojave, I think we definitely need to try and figure out how best to control that red brome and cheatgrass. And so hopefully those herbicide and seeding treatments will at least give us some information that we can draw on and move forward in the future. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Derek. I actually didn't find the Excel sheet in my computer, but your memory is very impressive with all the details you remembered from it. So I think we actually didn't need it.
That's fine. If anybody wants to see the data, we have it.
Awesome. Yeah, why don't you send it along? It sounds really interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Derek? Okay, I actually have a question, Derek. For your irrigation, did you take any measures to control the calcium or sodium in your water?
We did not, but we did analyze the water from the water source where we're getting our water, and it was pretty, it didn't come up as high really on any counts, and so it was acceptable. One of the things I think is important is we used to use a surface late irrigation system with super stands or sprinkler stands to put our water out, and I think we were putting the water out, but it wasn't as effective because we weren't putting it out fast enough to maybe account for the evaporation. And so I think as we did that many times, I think that did bring some of the salts in the soil up to the surface and maybe made it a little more saline. And we did have some cover caps that we had tried in the past, and they had some higher saline content in the surface. So that's why I think these systems, it puts out so much water and is very effective, and we don't seem to be having that salt issue with that.
Okay, thanks. All right, next is Kurt Duzer from the National Park Service. Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, hello all. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, Kurt Duzer with the National Park Service, going on 33 years of working in this area in my career, in primarily in restoration and plant management. Trying to get the thing to advance. Okay, there we go. So some common problematic invasive species in the Mojave Desert area and overlapping with tortoise habitat is, the annual exotic invasive grasses, the broma species, primarily cheatgrass, red brome, and also Mediterranean grass, schismus, and this Forbes species, primarily the Sahara mustard. Earlier this morning, we heard Kristen Berry mention the concern and alarm for Sahara mustard, potentially negatively impacting tortoise habitat. And we heard about from Todd Eskew about how red brome provides inferior, nutrition forage for tortoise. So those are some of the impacts. They obviously compete with other desirable native plants. And they add, particularly the grasses add hazard fuel, which may increase fire size, fire intensity, and frequency. And thus, when those occur, we reduce tortoise habitat quality for cover and forage both. And these species in particular are a large landscape scale problem. So here's an example of Sahara mustard on the right and schismus on the left, and just the idea of the large scale problem. So the best thing to do with invasive plant management is to survey, early detection and rapid response. And so we're partnering with the county and the Boulder City Conservation Easement, which Stefanie presented on earlier. And that's the approach we're managing there in tortoise habitat, is to try to keep things like Sahara mustard from increasing all over the landscape. And in this video or photo on the right is we detected bufflegrass, which is a perennial invasive grass species which alters fire regimes in the Sonoran Desert. And we actually found the first 13 plants within the Boulder City Conservation Easement, and one of the first recordings ever in the state of Nevada. So this is one of the best approaches to do. Oops, next, let's see. Okay, so, because of the landscape scale problem of most of the weed species affecting tortoise habitat, it really requires herbicide treatments. And I'm going to cover some strategies. Most of the invasive grass management is related to post-fire. So there's been lots of different aerial treatments, large scale, and then various ground applications. Again, most of the early management is on post-fire. So, the widespread herbicide application is post-fire. There's not a lot of leaves out there so you can really get the good target of invasive species for that. So, and then the other approach is preventative. So treating to prevent wildfires. So you protect the current tortoise habitat, and that has to be done on strategic locations, corridors, or perimeters or buffers around tortoise habitat. And then there's pre-emergent management of invasive species and post-emergent management. And then there's a broadcast methodology, which is usually uniform over a landscape or an area of treatment. And then there's spot or directed spray, which is very precise treatments. I mentioned earlier, landscape scale problem. And then the early detection is important for areas of tortoise habitat that are uninfested with these species. And then again, mentioning buffers and perimeters or working in the interior of current tortoise habitat. The good thing about most of these treatments using herbicides is they occur during tortoise dormancy to potentially reduce the effects or direct impacts to tortoise. So different herbicides. Derek mentioned earlier in his that plateau or mazapic is a common one that's historically been used for a good dozen years now or more. A newer product coming out is Rejuvra or Esplanade. It's Indaziflam, and that's got a lot of promise and selectivity for both of these are mostly for invasive annual grasses. We've evaluated and researched oust in the past as well. And then Roundup or glyphosate is important to add if you're doing these treatments in a post-emergent situation. One thing to note about like Imazapic and Indaziflam is they're very low rate use herbicides. So 4 to 6 ounces per acre is your typical rate, and that translates to over 99% water is what's being applied on the landscape on all these treatments, whether it's aerial or ground within the solution. So on the left is a post-emergent scenario where most of these pre-emergent soil residual active herbicides aren't real effective. They do have impact, but that's why adding glyphosate is important to reduce or to kill the plant, to cause mortality, so you don't allow it to go to produce seed. And the one on the right is more of a traditional pre-emergent. And both of these, like the Imazapic, has a 1 to 2 year generally effectiveness on reducing invasive grasses, and the Indaziflam is looking pretty promising for maybe 2 to 3 years. And of course, all that varies on your post-weather after application. So then the other methodology is unburned interspaces. So application, I mentioned most of the herbicide applications and management of invasive grasses have been post-fire. Well, how do we do it to prevent the habitat from burning in the first place? So this is our team working on some BLM areas we're basically selectively applying it to unburned and functional habitat. We're applying these herbicides to the interspaces where the red brome and sheetgrass seed bank may exist, and without doing any harm to the native perennial established species. So past and current projects, we've partnered a lot with the USGS, Henderson and Leslie DeFalco and Sarah's programs for many years. We've treated pretty much dozens and dozens of wildfires from basically 2004 to I'd say around 2014 was some of the last work. And most of this was smaller plots, anywhere from 1 hectare to even smaller than that, just finding out. And you can reference USGS for some of the results on that. Lots of combinations with seeding and herbicide and unseeding and just herbicide, those kinds of things. And I'm sure Leslie may mention some of that in the next talk. So current projects, we're continuing to work with the BLM at the Red Rock conservation area to around perimeters and trails to unburned areas to try to keep more from burning. Also in the Mormon Mesa ACEC, which is area of critical environmental concern, which is good tortoise habitat, and also the Paiute Valley ACEC. And we're targeting Sahara mustard in most of those situations right now, doing selective spot treatments in high value areas. And working, as I mentioned earlier, with Clark County Desert Conservation Program in the Boulder City Conservation Easement, which is in south of Boulder City in the El Dorado Valley. And we're also working on a project with Mojave National Preserve in California. There was a dome fire in 2019 that burned up a lot of habitat, and we're working on using Rejuvera herbicide in the retardant zones to try to prevent cheatgrass production in those areas, because the retardant is basically a phosphorus and nitrogen, so it's basically a fertilizer. So we want to make sure the impacts of fire suppression don't increase the potential to have cheatgrass and brome come in. And then we're working a long-term project with Joshua Tree National Park controlling fountain grass, which is a perennial species, which can also alter fire regimes on a landscape scale if it's not controlled. And I think that's that's all I got there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. That was a great overview. And fire is another topic that we'll be talking about in the next session if you want to talk any more about pre and post fire restoration methods. Okay, so next up we have Leslie DeFalco from the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. Leslie, feel free to share your screen if you can.
Okay, let's see.
Kurt, if you could stop sharing, awesome.
Okay, let's see. Can you all see? Let's see, it's not, oh, there. Can you all see the large screen, or do you see the little table of the version with table of contents on the left?
Yeah, we see the working version with table.
Okay. Great. Okay, so research team that I lead, we conduct studies on plant community restoration, and we focus on kind of the abiotic and biotic interactions that are underlying a lot of the success. And a lot of this is from our prior research, sort of an adaptive management or adaptive research framework, where we've learned a lot during the past 20 years. We're applying that now to landscape level manipulations. And research that we're currently addressing is the longevity of fuel breaks, really fuel break plant structure, the fine fuels and the woody fuels that are left, and how plateau is actually helping change that configuration. We're also evaluating techniques to create habitat islands and burned habitats, and focusing on landscape level manipulations, and also our common garden research on developing appropriate native plant material for desert restoration. So I'm going to just give you a glimpse of what some of those projects are. Let's see, it's not advancing, page down. Okay, so in collaboration with JJ Smith out of the Southern Nevada BLM office, we're expanding a lot of our knowledge from our earlier work on small experimental plots summarized in our 2013 Clark County report. We're expanding those really small experimental plots to landscape scale experiments, and some of the initial work we've done with fuel breaks is shown across this very large project with 12 sites. We've got Plateau, which has the imazapic as the active ingredient, significantly reducing non-natives after up to 2 years. These droplet cards that we put in place during the treatment areas show that the treatments are actually more dense, or the droplet density is more dense on the manual application. That was from Kurt's folks that applied those manual plots. And these are 1 hectare plots. So those are those 2 gray bars on the left. And
sorry to interrupt, but
no
I think
problem.
you're still sharing the title slide on this.
Really?
You can see.
Well, that's interesting.
You have 2 screens. It might be that you're sharing the wrong screen.
Are you seeing my notes and my?
Well, we're seeing the title. We're seeing the table view where you've got the slides on the side and then your main screen.
Really? Okay, let me see here. That's very interesting. I've got, well, let me just do it this way. So do you see the table of contents?
Now we're on fuel break landscape scale implementation.
That is so bizarre. Okay.
Sometimes,
Just because now I don't see it.
sometimes if you stop sharing and just try and
Okay, let me try it again.
just give it it's like turn it off again, turn it on again.
Yeah, good idea. Let's see if this works. Oops, did I see it yet?
Not yet.
Let me try one more time. Thank you for saying something, because yeah, it's cruising along.
So we see the fuel breaks landscape scale implementation slide now.
Okay, maybe I just can't open or expand it. Okay, well, can you see this fuel breaks landscape scale implementation with the yellow cards?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to just keep it at this scale because apparently it won't let me do the full screen. I don't know why.
I don't either, but we
Oh.
can see.
See, now did it disappear again?
We can still see the same slide with the.
Okay.
So are you in the slideshow?
Yeah, I'm going to just do this. If you guys can see this okay, I'm going to just go with this.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay, sorry for the delay here. So yeah, this is just showing how those, the application on the manual application was a lot higher herbicide density or droplet density compared to the aerial spray. Fuel breaks, we had sort of these unintended consequences of invasive grass replacement. And I think it's kind of consistent with what Derek was saying about how you can have these competitions between the invasive species taking over. Our non-natives were reduced on the large treatment plots for up to 2 years, which is consistent with what Kurt was just talking about. But, these are pretty long fuel breaks occurring at the halfway to site, and you can see them across the landscape that they're pretty well invaded by Russian thistle. And this is not common across all the sites, but it was certainly at this site, the temperature and rainfall patterns were promoting that invasion. So in addition to these habitat islands that we have across the landscape, we have 3 different re-veg treatments. We have white burr sage, creosote bush, and Joshua tree. And we're really focusing on these 3 species because these are those later cereal species that tortoises really need for cover. And they're also really important because they're super resilient in the face of climate change. And so we're really focusing on these longer life species. These outplanting treatments were applied to also deter rabbits, in part by putting them in rock cairns to protect that lower stem. In addition, we have 2 other seeding treatments. The manual sowing treatment, this was developed, this pipe was developed by JJ's folks in an effort to deliver the seed below the soil surface so that ants in particular couldn't collect the seed. And then we had kind of a diversionary seeding concept that was developed by Bill Longland and his colleagues up in Great Basin, where you basically apply a lot of seed, an abundant amount of seed that is small seeded species. In this case, it's millet that was killed in an oven and then distributed with these, the target species, the creosote bush, burr sage, and Joshua trees. The idea here is that the ants take the most numerous and small seeded species, and the rodents will take and cache the larger seeded species, with the hope that the environmental conditions will follow that will produce seedlings. And so I just wanted to say we're writing up this information right now. We have some preliminary results about the outplanting and the success and the survival being really strongly influenced by herbivory, but then secondarily in the longer term, we have some really interesting site-specific results that are coming out that'll be coming up soon. Moving on to native plant materials development, we've been developing priority species lists. This paper is recently published in the Natural Areas Journal, where we looked at the diet plants that are really important for animals based on observations across multiple sites across the desert. In addition, we've looked at more than 4,000 telemetered tortoises and observed where they were using cover and which plants they were using for cover. And all of that is compiled in this publication. And also, from this list of plants that tortoises are using, we're able to research a lot about the pollinator species that are using those plants. So a lot of that information is also included. And there's a tremendously long supplemental that goes with this publication that has a lot of great information about flowering times and any restoration information or recovery information that managers can use for selecting their plant species. Continuing with native plant materials development, we've been working for some time on common gardens, which are, it's a way of understanding local adaptation or how well adapted the seed sources within a species are for certain sites. And we construct these common gardens representing many of the different climate zones across the Mojave. We take populations from across the Mojave and put them in these different conditions and understand the trade-offs associated with these different climates. Nathan Custer is a graduate student who's working on this. We have his paper coming out in press talking about how these common gardens, how different species in the common gardens respond differently to these different ecoregional climate patterns. And so, for example, creosote bush, we saw a lot of trade-offs between growth and survival. And what was important for restoration is that arid adapted seed sources really should be matched to the restoration sites currently are expected to be experiencing drought. And I guess we're expecting a lot of regions within the Mojave to be expecting drought. So those trade-offs that the plants were demonstrating really emphasizes that we shouldn't be using the seed sources from those wetter populations or where they're found to be wetter and cooler. But we should be using these more arid adapted seed sources. And in contrast, white burr sage is really showing much more of a plasticity response. And so a lot of what controlled reproduction and survival depended on the initial size of the plants. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of our other studies, is that plant size for white burr sage as well as for Joshua tree are really important for outplanting success, regardless of where you are growing it in restoration projects across the Mojave. In addition to the common garden work, complementing that, we have landscape genetics, and Dan Shryak has been spearheading a lot of this work where we're trying to develop seed transfer zones using genetics, or where we can create species-specific models for where we should be collecting and using our plant materials. And then where we don't have genetic material or genetics information, we can use climate variation as a good model for adaptive genetic variability. And so a culmination of all of that landscape genetic works, we're really building on tools that are useful for restoration practitioners. This is the Climate Distance Mapper, which is a user-friendly web-based interface. And it allows the user for a couple things. First of all, you can use forward projections to say, here's a seed collection that I have on the landscape. Where should I plant the seeds from this given location so I know that they're pre-adapted to a future climate at a particular restoration site? So that's really informative because it's projecting into the future where that seed collection source can be used. And then we also have a feature, it's called a backward projection. And if you identify your restoration site, you can ask, where should I collect seeds that may be pre-adapted to future climate at a restoration site? And that's shown by these, this restoration site. All those dark blue areas are where you should collect to plant for a future climate. And then finally, Dan has been finishing up, it's in a review, but a manuscript on native plant materials development for seed menus. And this is another user interface, a web-based interface where you can select locations and basically ask which, in combination with species distribution models and our priority species list, where should we be finding or what are the best species for that particular location. And there's a lot of information that comes from the priority species list on life history and pollinators, and also tourist information that all feeds into the seed menu so that people can make their own seed collections for their particular restoration sites. And at that, I will end. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Leslie. And I'm really glad you talked about the importance of the correct plant materials and some tools. I think that'll transition well into Judy's presentation, which is coming up. Does anybody have any questions for Leslie before we transition? Okay, Judy, take it away.
Hi, let's see if I can get this going here. Okay, so do you see my presentation on the screen?
We see that presentation plus menu view.
Okay.
So if you go to slideshow and then from current slide.
Yeah, unfortunately okay, let's see if I can move that. Okay, I tried hitting the button on the bottom and it wasn't working.
Oh yeah, maybe that was it.
Okay, does that work better?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so I am the Mojave Desert Ecoregional Native Plant Coordinator with the Bureau of Land Management. So I work for the California State Office on paper, but I actually work throughout the Mojave Desert ecoregion. So into Utah, Nevada, Arizona, as well as California. And one of the primary goals of my position is determining what native plant materials are needed for restoration and then trying to make those available commercially. And we'll see if I can get it to change. Whoops, we went backwards or went forwards too far. So to get native plant materials, we first have to get the wildland seed collections, and this is done through the Seeds of Success program. We hire a number of seed collection crews every year through different offices, and some of these have been done under financial assistance agreements. More recently, we've been doing them more through contracts. And we make these collections and track these collections using the provisional seed transfer zones that Leslie just described that were developed by USGS. So we have all of these collections source identified, and we keep track of their source throughout the process with whatever is done with that seed. We have around 1,890 collections to date, and we've made about 800 new collections since 2016. Last year, despite the horrific drought, we still were able to get 38 new collections. We try to target priority species with a heavy emphasis on desert tortoise species, but also pollinator species and just general restoration species. But when we get these drought years, it kind of falls down to whatever the crews can find. So last year, we had some good rains in the summer in some areas, which meant there were some bumper crops of Amaranthus fimbriatus and Pectus paposus. So, you know, there were several collections of those, a few shrub species as well. Because we are following the Seeds of Success protocol, the first 10,000 seeds of every collection goes into long-term conservation storage. And then anything above the 10,000 seeds can be used for research or restoration projects or for commercial seed increase to get larger quantities of seed. That protocol is changing as of 2022. So this year, only the first 3,000 seeds will go into long-term storage instead of 10,000. So that will help us out a lot in getting seed materials to work with. We're also shifting to trying to get larger collections of up to ½ pound each. So to try to get more seed out of that little bit of seed that we can get in the wild, we have one tool, the Western States Seed Increase Contract. It's an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract. And there are species on there for the Mojave that have known growing protocols. So this is not just, any species in the Mojave. There's a finite list of species that we can have grown out on the seed contract. I put in delivery orders in 2019, 2020, and last year. The first 2 years, we requested that the growers do the initial wildland seed collections themselves. And then we had enough Seeds of Success seeds that I was able to use mostly our own collections for last year's delivery order. So this kind of goes through the species and the quantities that were requested in each of those years. A little side note for the bush muley and the Perry's lomatium, the grower was contracted to do the initial wild collections, and in 2 years of hunting, they have not been able to find any starter seed. So, trying to get the seed to do these commercial grow outs can be very tough and expensive. Right now we have 11,800 pounds total ordered for the Mojave, and covering or representing 12 of those provisional seed transfer zones. As far as the seed transfer zones, we're trying again to focus on areas where most of the restoration need is anticipated. And then for the other species that are of interest for restoration, for which there aren't currently established commercial growing protocols, we are funding some pilot forb seed increase projects with other nonprofit groups and with Victor Valley College. So Mojave Desert Land Trust has been trying to grow fringed amaranth and Sonoran sandman and chinchweed and desert dandelion. The California Botanic Garden just started this past year with getting their starter material to grow some perennial forbs. So Mojave Desert Land Trust is focusing on annual forbs. California Botanic Garden is focusing on perennial forbs. And then Victor Valley College has been an interesting partnership where they combined student capstone research projects with native plant materials development. Prior to a couple of years ago, they were focusing on container plant production. So they produced a lot of container plants for restoration on BLM lands. At the same time, they are also doing some experimental work to look at what promotes good seed germination, how is the best way to grow the plants, what kind of potting mixes work best, that sort of thing. And then a couple of years ago, they moved up into doing seed increase in the fields on campus and had very good success with alkali saccatone, Acton's brittle-bush, fringed amaranth, California buckwheat, Booth suncup. And then this year, they're also wanting to take on white burr sage. And they have started, or they are starting this year, taking this partnership a step further and partnering with PG&E at one of their mitigation restoration sites at Hinckley, California, of the movie fame with Aaron Brockovich. So they're going to try scaling up to more like a farm fields level. They've got about 5 or 6 acres to work with up there. And so they're going to focus on alkali saccatone, Acton's brittle-bush, Booth suncup, and white burr sage up there. So we're trying to develop some techniques for growing other species, and then also try to get more farmers interested in growing. A lot of the alfalfa farmers up in there are losing their water rights, and they have a choice of either abandoning their farm fields or converting them to solar, or trying to find another low water crop that they can grow instead. So there are some farmers up there interested in growing Mojave species for seed increase, which we need because at this point in time, there are no farmers in the Mojave ecoregion or near the Mojave ecoregion that are doing Mojave seed increase. So we're trying to move that forward. And then I also want to put in a plug for the nurseries that are doing container stock production for outplanting. We have a number of nurseries in the area. Song Dog Nursery at Lake Mead has already been mentioned. The Center for Arid Lands Restoration at Joshua Tree National Park, Victor Valley College, the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, Mojave Desert Land Trust, Nevada Division of Forestry, and Dale's Center for Urban Water Conservation at UNLV. And I just want to say that a lot of these nurseries are needing to know in advance, they kind of need a heads up of what the expectation is or what the need is for native plant production in the coming year or years. So anybody out there that is doing restoration and looking to have container plants grown, if you can give a heads up to your nursery of choice, that really helps them with both space planning and financial planning. So with that, I will end and take questions.
Thanks, Judy, for the great overview of plant materials, what's going on, where you can get plants. Very important. Any questions for Judy?
Yeah, Judy, this is Derek. Real quick, you mentioned the pounds. Are those bulk pounds or PLS pounds that you're wanting from the seed increase?
That's PLS. And I should, sometimes the question of cost comes up, and I should mention that the total of all that seed we've requested for seed increase, that comes to about $1.5 million.
And on that, when you're making those collections, are you looking at percent purity and percent, pure life seeds and bulk and that ratio, and kind of tracking that over time and precipitation? Maybe that might give us some indication on what things are doing out there.
Yeah, so the wildland seed collections, all of that seed goes to the Bend Seed Extractory that's managed by the U.S. Forest Service up in Bend, Oregon. And they clean the seed, they do all the basic tests, purity and viability. They don't do germination tests because a lot of these don't have standard germination tests that you can do. And they're small seed quantities, so we would probably use all of our seed just to do the test. So, but all those basic tests are done. All of that data is kept. And yeah, there are some years, like I guess a couple of years ago, we had a pretty good seed production in the spring, and then getting to summer, it turned hot and dry really fast. And so we had really good flowering on the Ariagnum fasciculatum, and then most of the seed was infertile. So yeah, we do get those collections where it's all, totally unviable seed or very low viability, but we do have records for all of those collections.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, we collected about 30-40 pounds of Ephedra nevadensis a few years ago. Thought we had, a bonanza, and yeah, there was nothing, no viable seed. So that's good you're tracking that. That's good to know.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so we need to